Despite industry development and policy support, an additional 81 million garments per annum could be sourced by South African retailers from local garment manufacturers by 2030. This is according to research conducted by the Localization Support Fund, aiming to bridge the gap between heavy industrial manufacturing and the rapidly growing digital retail space. Joining me on Zoom is the organization's Chief Executive Officer, Irshaad Kathrada. Irshaad, thank you so much for joining us.
Khaka, thank you so much for having us on the show. Really great to be here.
Well, your recent report estimates that offshore e-commerce players could cost South Africa 34,000 jobs by 2030. What specific competitive gaps make local manufacturers so vulnerable to these international platforms?
Yeah, look, there's a lot in that particular question. If I look at what the offshore e-commerce retailers have done particularly well in South Africa, but they're doing this around the world, is they've come in with an offering that is incredibly cheap. Now, a lot of the time it's cheap because they are bypassing certain laws and regulations that South African manufacturers would have to abide by. So one of the things we found when we did our research, and this was older research that we had published in August last year, is that we look at the taxes that are being levied against the products. Some of the offshore retailers for a long term weren't paying a lot of those taxes, or indeed weren't advertising what the full price is to consumers. So when a consumer goes online and they click on an item of clothing, be it a t-shirt, a jacket, or whatever, they see a price that doesn't include all of the taxes that they would need to pay ultimately. And we're talking taxes like VAT, we're talking customs duties that other companies would be subject to. And so this has been a massive challenge, not only for manufacturers, but for retailers as well. And one of the things that we've wanted to do with this most recent piece of work is to look at how can we get South African manufacturers and retailers to collaborate and coordinate a little bit better so that we can bridge some of that gap. And where exactly are the products that retailers want to localize, how much of it is there, and whether or not we can make a credible business case for local manufacturers to take part of that.
And LSF research shows a huge untapped e-commerce market in townships. What are the main barriers like logistics, payments or digital skills that the fund is currently working to unblock?
Absolutely. So first of all, I think we have to acknowledge that retail is changing around the world, but particularly in South Africa. So through the work, and again, this was earlier work that we had published in August last year, we found that retail sales online account for around about 10% of total sales. Now, there are a lot of, as you say, structural barriers as to why that hasn't grown. In other parts of the world, including competitor countries, it's closer to maybe 15, 20%. Now, we expect that number to grow in South Africa. It will grow. As you say, things are coming, there are structural elements that are changing. Financial literacy is changing, access to network, to mobile phones, etc. is changing, but also there's a greater proliferation of offerings in the townships. And I think that last mile delivery is also starting to improve quite a lot. Now, that's both an opportunity for local manufacturers and for local retailers, but it's also a potential threat. The potential threat is if we continue to cede the space to offshore e-commerce players like Shein and Temu. Where there's an opportunity is obviously if local retailers working hand in hand with South African manufacturers can access that space. Now, agility is the name of the game. I think one of the things that a consumer is looking for when they go online and they choose anything from a jacket to a t-shirt is, one, they want the right style, they want the right fashion, they want the right price. Other consumers might care about sustainability, they might also care about how long it's going to take for them to get there. All of these things are incredibly important. So the work we published today was really an important piece in trying to say, what is it that actually consumers want? And that's where the 81 million garments that you referred to at the top of the show is quite an important number, because you cannot make industrial strategy if you don't know the direction in which you need to go. So this is the most comprehensive study that's been done in the retail market in South Africa, certainly in the clothing and textile retail space, trying to understand how big is demand in South Africa for locally manufactured goods, what are the product categories, what are the prices, what are the fashion and sustainability points that everyone needs to meet, but also, do we have the manufacturing capacity in the country? So we surveyed not only the major retail groups, but we also surveyed manufacturers. There are about 450 thereabout manufacturing companies, clothing manufacturing companies in South Africa. We got about 200 of those to participate, so about 50%. participated in our study. And from that, we were able to see that there is a lot of capability, there's a lot of capacity, but there are challenges. So let's take basic knits, for example. We found that actually the market for basic knits, that's t-shirts and those types of garments, is growing quite rapidly in South Africa, and there's a massive opportunity. But of course, you're competing on price. And I think we can never forget about that we are in an environment where the consumer is massively constrained. And so we have to make sure that the price is right. Now, for a long time, the conventional wisdom is to say, well, don't bother with t-shirts because we could never get to the kind of price points that China or Bangladesh gets to. I think what our work has shown is actually that's not true. That at the right level of scale, we can get there. Now, it's arguable that the South African manufacturers, the typical size is too small. We need to try and bolt this on. So what are we doing as the Localization Support Fund? Well, we're working very closely now with retail, and we're asking them in a sense to, quote unquote, put their money where their mouth is. They've said that there's this demand, but how can we work them through a strategic procurement commitment from retail so that it allows manufacturers to make the necessary investments in scaling up their facilities and bringing in new labor, bringing in new machinery. We've worked very closely with Labour, and Labour have said, look, some of the adaptability and flexibility and shift arrangements that might be required to make this model work, they would be prepared to come to the table. They need to see that there are commitments from retail, but they'd be prepared to come to the table as well. And we've also spoken and engaged with some of the big capital providers like the IDC, the Industrial Development Corporation, to say, if this model could be brought together, would you be prepared to put funding behind it? So we're bringing this sort of coalition of the willing, if you will, to try and make South African fashion as agile and as cost conscious as possible, because we know that that's what consumers want at the end of the day.
And just lastly, the LSF recently helped Khaka replace 79.6 million rands in imports through local manufacturing. What lessons from the furniture sector can be applied to the apparel and textile sectors to fight against import surges?
You know, I think one of the things that we did so well with Choreographed and part of that exercise was, one, there was strategic commitment from the retailers. So Choreographed is part of the Foschini group. And so not only is Choreographed providing furniture for the Choreographed brand, but they're doing it for At Home, for Dial-A-Bed, for Volpes. These are the various other retail offerings that the Foschini group had. And they've taken a sort of a strategic view to do that. But I think the other thing that was quite important was the data. I think understanding what your market is, where your market is going, and then also how quickly you are able to adjust to it is so important. I think using smart data and being able to adjust your manufacturing processes and your output according to data is going to be important for manufacturing. I think this is the different ways in which the fourth industrial revolution is meeting manufacturing to make localization work in South Africa.
Well, Irshaad, I liked when you said agility is the name of the game, but we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Khaka. I really appreciate it.
That was the CEO of the Localization Support Fund, Irshaad Kathrada, sharing key insights into South Africa's garment industry.